We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and we have been perusing this particular book, The Legacy of Mesopotamia, edited by Stephanie Dalley, a renowned Assyriologist, top in her field. We found it very, very interesting. It gave us the impression that the claimed histories inside the Bible may actually be historical error. We'll get to that in a moment. You're probably wondering who was Stephanie Dalley. Well, she was a British Assyriologist and scholar of the ancient Near East. She has since retired as a teaching fellow from the Oriental Institute, Oxford. She was known for her publications of cuneiform texts and her investigation into the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and her proposal that it was situated in Nineveh and constructed during Sennacherib's rule. She worked as a volunteer as a schoolgirl on archaeological excavations at Verulamium, Cirencester at Bignor Villa. In 1962, she was invited by David Oates, a family friend, to an archaeological dig he was directing in Nimrud, northern Iraq. Here she was responsible for cleaning and conserving the discovered ivories. Between 1962 and 1966, she studied Assyriology at Newnham College, Cambridge, part of the Cambridge University, and followed it up with a PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies, London. In the years 1967 to 66 to 67, Page was awarded a fellowship by the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, and she worked at the excavation at Tel al-Rimah as epigrapher and register. The tablets excavated at Tel al-Rimah formed the subject of her PhD thesis, and later for a book for the general readership, Mari and Karana, two old Babylonian cities in Iraq, where she met Christopher Dalley, now a chartered engineer, whom she later married. Then they had 2 children, and so forth. From 1997 to 2007, Dalley taught Akkadian and Sumerian at the Oriental Institute, Oxford University, being appointed Shillito Fellow in Assyriology in 1988. She is an honorary senior research fellow of Somerville College, a member of Common Room at Wolfson College, and a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. Dalley took part in archaeological excavations in the Aegean, Iraq, Syria, Jordan and Turkey. She has published extensively, both technical editions of texts from excavations in national museums and more general books. She has been involved in several television documentaries. Mythology. Dalley published her own translations of the main Babylonian myths: Atrahasis, Anzu, the descent of Ishtar, Gilgamesh, the epic of creation, Era and Isham. Collected into one volume, this work has made the Babylonian corpus accessible for the first time to the student of general mythology, and it is widely used in university teaching, and so forth. The Sea Land. Dalley published in 2009 an archive of some 470 newly found cuneiform texts, and deduced that they had originated in the southern Mesopotamian kingdom, previously known as the Sea Land, which flourished around 1500 BC. This fills a significant gap in modern historical knowledge. Her analysis of the text has made it possible to identify tablets in other museums and collections as being from the Sea Land dynasties. There's her selected publications below. And she's done some papers and radio and television appearances. So let's have a look at this particular book by Stephanie Dalley. By perusing about 2,000 volumes, very few of which owing to the abstruseness of the contents are ever handled by students, we have gathered 20,000 noteworthy facts, with a great number of facts in addition that were either ignored by our predecessors, or those who came before us, or have been discovered by our subsequent research. Nor do we doubt that there are many things that have escaped us too. For we are only human and beset with duties, and we pursue this sort of interest in our spare moments. Pliny, Preface to Natural History. Well, that's in the lines of William Shakespeare's rant, "To err is human, but to forgive is divine. We are human, we make mistakes." Preface. An unusual degree of patient cooperation between the contributors has allowed this book to reach its present form. The editor's aim has been to produce a book which can be read from beginning to end as a coherent composition. To achieve this, the contributors have been exceptionally tolerant of editorial interference in harmonizing, eliminating overlaps, and incorporating suggestions, including specific material, and the editor is grateful to them. That would be Stephanie Dalley. Many people have generously contributed time, criticism, and knowledge to the final result, the book that you're now reading. The authors are indebted to the following, and so forth. Stephanie Dalley is responsible for others, and a few of them are joint efforts, including the maps, and that's talking about these works contained in the book. She was responsible for others, drawings and maps, etc., and a few of them are joint efforts, including the maps. We're also deeply indebted to several libraries in Oxford, etc., etc. Spelling of names given by classical authors mainly conform to usage in Pauli Wassalwa's Real Encyclopedia der Klassikerischen, some sort of German words there, Alte Umschriftschaft, Stuttgart, 1894 to 1980. Spelling of Akkadian names conform to current transliteration except when a biblical form is in common usage. In an attempt to avoid overloading the work with the annotation, bibliography has been restricted and given by section within each chapter, but extensive footnotes have been allowed for chapters 4 to 6. The editor is responsible, Stephanie Dalley, for the omissions and inconsistencies that remain. Oriental Institute, Oxford, April 1996. There is your contents page. We just read notes on contributors. Here's a list of illustrations and maps, abbreviations, introduction by Stephanie Dalley, and so forth. And then a general index. Notes on contributors, list of illustrations, abbreviations, list of maps, chronological charts, chart of languages and scripts. These are all Semitic. First you had the pictographic, hieroglyphic, then the logographic and syllabic, syllable and alphabetical. And the Semites were the Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Ugaritic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Phoenician, Syriac, Arabic languages that came from that. Then you had the Indo-European, which was the Luwian, Neo-Hittite, Hittite, Old Persian, Mycenaean Greek, Linear B, Classical Greek and Latin. Other Egyptian, Sumerian, Elamite, Hurrian, Urartian, Armenian, all using the cuneiform wedge-shaped script. Here is a map of that, of Mesopotamia and adjacent lands in the early periods. Introduction, Stephanie Dalley. Between the two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, lies the alluvial land known as Mesopotamia. There, one of the world's very earliest civilizations arose. Brick-built cities and writings are two of its distinctive hallmarks, and the ancient names of its cities still echo around the world today. Ur of the Chaldees, Babylon and Nineveh. For the Sumerians, who first lived in southern Mesopotamia, Uruk, biblical Iraq, or Iraq, modern Iraq today, was the seat of ancient kingship and early narrative literature. For the Babylonians, who superseded them, or who came before them, Babylon was the centre of the world. For the Assyrians, Ashur, A-S-H-U-R, not A-S-H-E-R, son or descendant of Jacob in the Bible, was their most ancient capital. Nineveh, their most glorious royal residence, and Haran, their final seat of royalty. All those people wrote upon clay using hundreds of wedge-shaped signs, first in Sumerian, later in Akkadian, which is the name now given to the writing or the written language of the Babylonians and Assyrians. What was their relationship to other early civilizations? This question has been tackled in several different ways during the last century or so, and some of the answers have contradicted others. Premature conclusions have been dismissed as better evidence has come to light. Diverse religious, political and cultural groups have argued for or against influence with equal passion. Scholarship in ancient Near Eastern studies has made huge progress, yet the challenge still stands. This book takes up that challenge because the evidence is now more plentiful and better understood than before. The burden of proof can be tackled by combining different kinds of evidence, chronological, textual and archaeological, from different times and places. The ruins of Nineveh and Babylon were rediscovered by explorers from Western Europe in the 19th century and have been excavated in fits and starts ever since. Assyriology, which is a study of Babylonian and Assyrian culture, began with those first excavations. The pioneers who first uncovered and studied the eroded remnants of Mesopotamian civilization had a clear general view of its influence upon the rest of the world. Light from the east and the cradle of civilization were two of the catchphrases that excited the educated people of Europe and the USA. They perceived that so high a level of cultural attainment, so much earlier than the achievements of classical Greece, must inevitably have been at the root of urban literature or literate civilization. Yet certain reservations remained. Egypt seemed to have blossomed into an urban literate culture at much the same time, although without scientific dating methods it was impossible to say whether Egypt or Mesopotamia came first. India, with its Indus Valley cities and its Sanskrit literature, also laid claims to priority which were hard to assess, not only because the comparative dating of archaeological deposits was in its infancy, but also because the antiquity of its written traditions could only be guessed at from later survivals. Eventually it became possible to date the beginnings of culture in both India and China, where the development of cities and writings appeared to be later than in the Near East. Scholars of ancient Mesopotamian culture had the enormous advantage that its writings were impressed on clay, which does not perish in the way that most other writing materials do. On the other hand, clay surfaces are easily damaged by water and knocks, and the writing system used upon them was of awful complexity. Only slow and painfully was it possible to come to a correct understanding of important texts. Until Assyriology presented this new challenge, the basis for our knowledge of cultural evolution had been secure since the Renaissance. People assumed that classical Greek culture, based mainly upon Athens, and the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Bible, based upon Jerusalem, comprised the two early traditions from which our own culture stemmed. The 8th century BC gave it an approximate starting point to the process. Although Chaldean wisdom supposedly featured in some of the Hermetic and oracular writings of late antiquity, most scholars agreed that they were new compositions forged during the time of the Roman Empire to look as if they were much older. True, the ancient Egyptians had written their hieroglyphic inscriptions on tombs and temples in the Nile Valley at a much earlier period, and there was no denying their stupendous achievements in architecture and sculpture, still visible above ground in shining stone. The bare mounds of mud brick rubble in Iraq could not compete with glorious granite and marble, whether in Egypt or in Greece and Ionia. But the forms of Egyptian literature, early though they were in comparison with Greek and Hebrew, seem to have left barely a trace in Greek and Jewish culture. The worship of ibises, cats and hippos to the world of African anthropology belonged to the world of African anthropology and had no links with the Olympian gods or Israelite monotheism. It seemed that Egypt, Greece and the Bible could keep their cultural autonomy safe after all. The great names of kings, queens and cities from ancient Mesopotamia were known, of course, from the pens of Greek writers and from books of the Bible. Semiramis, Sardanapalus, Ninos and Nebuchadnezzar were legendary names, but the colours in which they were painted gave a picture of unedifying barbarity. rapacious conquerors who indulged in excesses of food, drink, and woman, castrators of boys, extortionate usurers who ground the fate of the oppressed into the dust, destructive empire builders who were insensitive to adjacent cultures. Such damning hyperbole is, as we all know from modern examples, an inevitable part of the public image created against powerful and distant alien. During the early years of Assyriology, the belief that outstanding men could change the course of history competed with a growing belief in economic forces beyond the control of individuals, and in an ethnic character that went hand in hand with language groups. According to this, exceptionally gifted men were only the tools of inexorable fate, but some racial groups were intellectually superior to others. Archaeologists busily measured cranial capacity and proportions, applying the sciences of phrenology and craniology to the skeletons of people long dead. The Semitic mentality and the Indo-European cast of mind were concepts applied to modern and ancient people alike, which made it rash to link achievements across ethnic boundaries. Nineveh and Memphis, Jerusalem and Athens were sharply divided both by race and by language. In the new field of linguistics, the Indo-European languages were extensively studied because their highly inflected forms were thought to be more sophisticated than the structures of other groups of language. Early translations of Mesopotamian literature were so halting and literal that they seemed to confirm that assessment, and it was easy to relegate Babylonian culture to a backwater confined to its own small world of esoteric writing. It turns out that some of the brilliance of cuneiform text was intimately connected to the clever manipulation of the signs, and so there were crucial features of the written literature which could not be translated into languages written in alphabetic scripts. To mock Babylonian scriptures in inadequate translation was all too simple, just as the denouncers of those early Christian heresies which had adopted pagan texts found it easy to ridicule them. Semitic languages in general were relegated to the periphery of scholarship, giving way to a core of more prestigious learning in Indo-European languages. Very few people question the assumption that language group and ethnic group were inextricably bonded together. Early attempts to prove that one culture depended upon another began with that unjustified assumption that different language groups, especially Semitic and Indo-European, stood for ethnic groups with distinct racial characteristics. Environment was thought to be a much less influential factor than language and genetic grouping, which we reckon to be self-contained and static. Okay, and there's lots and lots more of this information. We're not going to read the entire Bible version of it. Okay, you can read that all in your own time, at your own pace, if you wanted to read the book. Chapter 1, Occasions and Opportunities to the Persian Conquest, Stephanie Dalley. Proto-historic times, around 3,500 to 3000 BC. Far back in time when the earliest forms of writing began, cities already sprawled along the banks of the two great rivers in Lower Mesopotamia. Writing seems to have developed there out of an accounting system. Our first evidence is limited to geometric tokens of solid clay, sometimes enclosed in clay envelopes, a stone cylinder carved with a design, and so forth. Okay, we are jumping ahead to the more important information that we want you to take note of. The need to invent such a system must have been overwhelming, so enormous was the extent of those very early cities, Uruk, Gusu, Kish and Susa, that the supply and storage of foodstuff for the teeming populace and sacrifices for their numerous deities required a rigorous system of control and an elite of administrators. And there's more on Mesopotamia and their influences, supposed influence on how it affected Egypt and so forth. And what do we have here? The Egyptian system of writing had features which are identical with some in Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, the written languages of early Mesopotamia. It contains a mixture of logographic, one sign for a whole word, and syllabic signs. It uses determinatives, signs which are not pronounced but show the category of an adjacent sign, for example whether it stands for an object made of wood or of stone. Even the verbal system of the Egyptian language is reckoned to have had the same parent as the Semitic verbal system, having left it as an offshoot at an early age, and so forth. Merchants and sealings in Anatolia. Evidence comes from a single Assyrian merchant colony at Kadesh near Kayseri in central Anatolia, derived from the parent city Ashur on the Middle Tigris, a journey of about 6 weeks. It consists of business records, which use a rather limited range of cuneiform signs. They date between about 2000 and 1700 BC, and were found in houses of 2 successive levels of occupation. When the Hittites formed their first dynasty at Hattusa around 1700 BC, they did not bring a pure Indo-European culture to a region of undeveloped barbarism. It was upon the higher culture of Mesopotamia, already 1500 years old, that they based their models for many social and religious institutions, even if they knew about it only at second hand from foreign traders and from sporadic encounters with soldiers from Agadir, until much later they conquered Syrian cities. The background of long-standing contact, whether continuous or intermittent, from the late 4th millennium explains why the Hittites adopted the cuneiform script, why Hittite myths and treatises of the mid-2nd millennium incorporate several major Babylonian deities in positions of high respect, as well as referring with reference to the city of Nippur, and why their law code texts are like those of Assyria and Babylonia, both in formulation and in the subject matter. Since the Hittites also had an older hieroglyphic writing system, which is more like that of Egypt, we cannot claim that Mesopotamia alone influenced their cultural development, but simply that it was a contributor. However, Egyptian gods, places and personal names are not found in Hittite texts except in international correspondence. The direction of influence is clear. An impression from a cylinder seal found on an envelope of the second level at Kadesh around 1700 exhibits purely Mesopotamian iconography. Hittite myths about gods are not found in Babylonian literature. Even when Mursili, the Hittite king, eventually made a lightning raid on Babylon around 1651, he left behind no marks of influence, cultural or political. Scribes at Hattusa often had Babylonian personal names, but scribes in Babylon never had the Hittite names. Mesopotamian influence in general spread mainly through trading and business activities rather than direct dominations. This was helped by a major development in Mesopotamian society at that time, namely the finance of investment and insurance. The ancient Babylonians and Assyrians, inhabiting rich alluvial land with no mineral resources, used trade to build up a stock of gold, silver, copper and lead for currency from which new enterprises could be funded. Much of the business was undertaken by private individuals who used the banking facilities of temples and palaces and so forth. You got gemstones from the eastern cities of the Indus Valley, i.e. India. Implication of the Sumerian king list, and more on Mesopotamia. High culture from the sages. At the heart of Mesopotamian traditions about the origins of writing and the arts of civilized life lies the story of the 7 sages, briefly recounted by Berossos in the Hellenistic period. The Greeks were first called the Hellenes, for the benefit of a royal patron, confirmed by passing allusions in late cuneiform texts. The tale was fundamental to ancient belief about Babylonian origins. The great god Ea, so the tradition runs, sent 7 sages to earth long before the flood in order to teach mankind all the arts and skills of civilization, such as building cities, kingship, music, metallurgy and agriculture. Each sage was associated with a different legendary king in one of the early cities, such as Eridu, where kingship first arose under the patronage of Ea; Sippar, the city of Shamash, the sun god, whose early king Emiduranki has connections with the biblical Enoch; Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh, or Erech, today's modern Iraq; and Kish, ruled by kings with Semitic, not Sumerian names. All these kings are listed in the Sumerian king list. The sages were represented as holy carp, fish who had risen up from the sweet waters of the Apsu years dwelling in the southern city of Eridu and were banished back again after angering the gods by their bad behaviour. In addition to the original 7, there were other sages after the flood who were only partly divine and who were attached to the courts of historical kings, such as Assyriologist, Mansim, the sage of Hammurabi of Babylon. No foreign elements can be detected in this tradition, which is closely linked, like the Sumerian king list, to the flood, and there is no reason to doubt that it is indigenous. The Egyptians had sages, but they were all historical men of learning attached to the courts of known pharaohs or kings. The earliest was Imhotep, the architect and chancellor of Djoser, around 2650 BC, far later than the pre-flood era of Mesopotamian legend. Like those who followed him, he was of mortal birth. He was deified as a reward for his achievements, but did not arrive on earth as an immortal being sent from heaven. Therefore, the Egyptian tradition does not claim either the antiquity or the divine mission that is characteristic of Mesopotamia. Syria too had a tradition about sages that resembles that of Mesopotamia rather than that of Egypt. Sanchuniathon, a Phoenician, is said to have written a work before the Trojan War, which Philo of Byblos claimed to transmit in around AD 100. Philo's writings in turn were transmitted in extracts by Eusebius around AD 160 to 340. This tradition lists some 14 generations of supermortals who invented the skill needed for civilized life, particularly in its technological aspects and so forth. School curriculum and cuneiform. Carries on from there.